Episode 6. Russia, the Deep State, and the Cold War, Part 1. As we've already established in previous episodes, when the Cold War started, the Wallenbergs had established dominance within the intelligence community. Ericsson had a monopoly on telecommunications, and the cryptograph company now had a gentleman's agreement with the newly formed National Security Agency. Isn't that fortunate? Furthermore, Allen Dulles, who was deeply in bed with the Wallenbergs, was now the head of the CIA. And the CIA and cryptograph would also later sign a licensing deal for more than 140,000 cryptographer machines to be manufactured and sent to the Allied intelligence services. Imagine how lucky they are, everything just keeps falling into place. Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of Nazi intelligence, stationed on the Eastern Front during the war, somehow escaped prosecution in the Nuremberg trials. What is even more strange is the fact that after the Second World War, Gehlen became the head of intelligence for West Germany. He was spymaster of the CIA-affiliated, anti-communist, Gehlen organization. He was also the founding president of the Federal Intelligence Service of West Germany and their expert on Russia. How is this even possible, and why isn't this common knowledge? We can't go into all the details about this, but let's just say that he played a key role in cleaning up the evidence that incriminated the Wallenberg family in their activities during the Second World War. That might just have given Gehlen enough leverage on the right people to escape Nuremberg and still be considered useful. Remember what the United States had said after the Bosch affair. The Wallenberg brothers were saved more by the start of the Cold War rather than by any improvement in their business ethics. Again, were they simply lucky? Well, if it's only down to luck, the Wallenbergs must have been the luckiest family in all of history. I guess that indeed could have been the case. Or we could instead phrase it like this. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. We need to make two things absolutely clear. 1. In these types of geopolitical games, these players don't just plan 1 or 2 steps ahead. The Wallenberg family has even stated publicly that they see their strategic business decisions, at least, on a 100-year timeline. 2. Russia has always been in the crosshairs for the deep state. Control of the creation of money and control of information is only part of it. They are mechanisms of control. The main goal of the game is called control of natural resources. The country with the largest area, by a certain logic, contains the most natural resources. The largest country in the world is, of course, Russia. In order for you to understand just how far back the planning of the Cold War goes, we have to go back to the early 1900s, and again, we find ourselves in the Parliament of Sweden. But first, in 1905, the deep state performed their first attempt of a revolution in Russia. In the year before, in 1904, the deep state pulled on the strings of the Japanese Emperor, Tokuhoshi, and started the Russian-Japanese War. The funding for this war came from an American banker called Jacob Schiff. The Russian-Japanese War was meant to weaken the Russian military to create space for the upcoming Russian Revolution. Japan launched an attack at the Russian naval base in Port Arthur, in Liaodong Peninsula in China, after first starting mock negotiations with Russia in order to catch them off guard. In December of 1905, the Tsar of Russia, Nikolai II, managed to overcome the revolutionaries. The leaders of the revolutionaries, including a man called Lev Trotsky, were imprisoned. During this time, between 1905 and 1907, some interesting individuals with familiar last names sat together in Swedish Parliament, representing the Liberal Coalition Party. How about Carl Warburg? Yes, of the same Warburg family as from earlier episodes. Remember the Warburg Bank? Knut Agathon Wallenberg, board member of Stockholm's Enskilda Bank. Also founded British Bank of Northern Commerce. Gustav Wallenberg. He was later Sweden's first diplomat in Japan and East Asia, also founded the East Asian Company, which was basically a carbon copy of the old East India companies. Sven Palm, founder of the Thule Life Insurance Company, as you can remember from previous episodes as well, with the Nazis' lists. An Arvid Lindman, admiral, member of the Protectionist Party. He was also Director General of the Telegraph Board during this time, and chairman of the Swedish Public Telephone Company, which later was consolidated with Ericsson. Arvid Lindman did some strange things. Perhaps one of the strangest things was when he gave away money to the Bolshevik revolutionary Vladimir Lenin right before the Second Russian Revolution. Is it really customary for right-leaning politicians to give money to Bolshevik revolutionaries? Which brings us to the deep state's second attempt of revolution in Russia. Remember Lev Trotsky, who was the leader of the revolutionaries in the First Revolution. He later managed to flee to the United States. In the United States, he was recruited by Jacob Schiff. The same Jacob Schiff who provided the funding for the Russian-Japanese War. It's a small world, after all. The Schiff family was deeply connected to both the American side of the Warburg family and good friends with Theodore Roosevelt, who had gotten the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for mediating in that same Russian-Japanese War. Small world, indeed. In case you haven't figured that out just yet, the Nobel Prize is controlled by the Wallenberg family and is given to individuals who has proven themselves useful or to lend credibility to their character. Remember Barack Obama. He got the Nobel Peace Prize having barely set foot in office. I wonder why. Meanwhile, during the same period in time, the stock market crashed in the panic of 1907. This was like all other crashes of the stock market, engineered by the deep state. This was done to pave the way for the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913. To keep the control of money, the deep state needed the Fed. Back to the story. Lev Trotsky had been recruited by Jacob Schiff and was subsequently trained on the Rockefeller estate in guerrilla warfare. Might they have been preparing for something? Which brings us to Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Second Bolshevik Revolution, and the start of the second attempt. Lenin was, so to speak, laying low in Switzerland when it was decided in 1917 that the operation was a go. Max Warburg, the chairman of M. Warburg and Company, the Warburg Bank, arranged for Lenin's travels through Europe. Lenin ended up in Sweden, which could of course be a total coincidence, just like it always seems to be. While in Sweden, somebody supplied Lenin with a nice new suit. He was also given money, as we said earlier, by the Admiral, Arvid Lindman. Lenin would after that make his way towards Russia, through Finland. Little not so insignificant Sweden always seemed to be in the center of it all. Would you have imagined that? The person responsible for Lev Trotsky's return to Russia was a man called Claude Danzy. Danzy was a member of MI5. The fact that the intelligence community was involved in the Russian Revolution might not come as a complete shock. As the deep state has gotten more influence and power, old power structures started coming under its control as well, such as the British Empire. Let's say it once more. Control of money and information buys control of governments. This time, the revolution was successful. On July 17, 1918, Tsar Nikolai II and his family were executed outside Yekaterinburg. The execution was ordered by a man named Yurovsky. He later recounts in his memoirs that night, in July 1918. Among other things, the young Alexei, who was lying on the floor in a pool of blood but still breathing, was executed by Yurovsky himself, with 2 shots to the head. All in all, the execution took 20 minutes, partly due to the smoke formation that occurred in the room as a result of the arquebusing. The executors had to evacuate the room to get rid of the smoke. When the latter re-entered the room, they discovered that there were still people in there who were alive, including some of the Tsar's daughters. It later turned out that the girls were so difficult to kill, for the reason that they had most of their jewels sewn into their corsets, which served as a kind of armor. Instead, the Tsar's daughters were stabbed to death, and their skulls smashed with pistols. According to Yurovsky's own account, the majority of the men who carried out the murders were heavily intoxicated, and were incredibly clumsy when carrying out the execution. When everyone was dead, the bodies were loaded onto trucks and transported to a previously selected location. They then undressed the corpses and stole the valuables that they were wearing. Sulfuric acid and kerosene were poured over the bodies, and then they burned them. The remains were buried in a shallow grave that was not discovered until 1989. Let's just put it like this. If the Russian people has an axe to grind with the deep state, it's not without reason. What happened in Russia after the revolution was a classic case of divide and conquer. Lenin, however, governed Russia until his death in 1924. Joseph Stalin, who took power after Lenin's death, was a bit harder for the deep state to control. Stalin really believed in communism, while the deep state had just utilized it as a tool to drive out the Tsar. Stalin was also a bit paranoid. For some reason, he had gotten it in his head that someone was wiretapping the telephones. Follow us into the next episode, where we will continue the story about Russia, the deep state, and the Cold War. Thank you for listening.